You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 13th of January 2026 on Monocle Radio.
Has the time come for Europe to speak to Russia? Has Elon Musk's X done something actually genuinely amusing? And is telling your phone you're still alive every day actually any better than being eaten by your cat? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Georgia Scaturo and Stephen DL will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Monocle's team at Pitti Uomo in Florence. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and we will hear shortly from Georgia Scaturo and Stephen DL. But first, I am joined from Pitti Uomo in Florence by Monocle's Associate Editor for Design and Fashion, Grace Charlton. Grace, welcome to the show. How is the weather, first of all, in Florence? It must be nicer than here.
I'm actually not sure. It's very London-y. It's super foggy. Well, you can barely see the river.
But can you at least see what people are wearing? By which I'm asking, when you go to Florence during Pitti Uomo, how different is it from going to Florence at any other juncture?
I would say Florence is a very fashionable city, but it does amp it up around this time of the year. All the men are out in their coats and beige cashmere. They like to perch their outerwear on their shoulders, just so. There are a lot of leather gloves, a lot of big hats, and a lot of fur this year, interestingly enough.
I do want to come back to that, but in terms of the fashion calendar, because Pitti Uomo is obviously, and I'll just check the date again, held very early on, is it regarded as something of a tone setter for the imminent calendar?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's very industry driven. A lot of people today describe Pitti Uomo as like an aperitivo before the main event, which is, Milan and Paris, the men's fashion weeks there. But it's very real in the sense that people come here to work and, meet buyers and meet the press. So it's still a big event.
It says here that this year's theme is motion. Do you get any idea yet of how that is actually manifesting?
There's a lot of outerwear. It's the winter edition, so there are a lot of coats, but there's particularly a lot of puffer coats. And I wonder if that's Cortina Olympics related. There's a massive emphasis on technical wear, and not necessarily from ski brands, but from Erno and Italian houses like that.
I mean, Italy will, of course, shortly be hosting the Winter Olympics. Are you seeing anything acknowledging that? I mean, are the puffer jackets are they endowed with any of the, accoutrements or general flair that might be associated with a ski jumper or a curler?
Yeah, little pockets for the ski pass, maybe. There is some of that. There are some obvious après-ski nods, mountains on a knitted jumper. I saw at Brunello Cucinelli, this sort of very iconic Italian designer, he even had branded skis. So yes, definitely. It's definitely on the mind of designers at the moment.
You mentioned the fur coat revival that some are trying to float. Is that going to be controversial, and is that perhaps at least partially the idea?
I think it's like a full circle moment almost on sustainability because, fur coats have been banned by a lot of big Italian houses and it was sort of seen as a no-no. But I've noticed that they're creeping back into people's consciousness, especially among a younger generation who see fake fur as worse for the environment because it's made from plastic quite often. I spoke to an Italian fashion student today who was wearing a fur coat, and I asked him how he felt about it. And he said it's okay if it comes from your nonna's wardrobe, if it's a hand-me-down, if it's vintage. So it's funny to see how conversations can shift in the space of 2 to 3 years.
So the fur coat's fine if the animal was dead anyway?
Exactly.
Okay, good to know. It is quite early on in this event. I mean, what are you most looking forward to in coming days?
I think so. They've got a few guest designers this year. They've got two Japanese ones. Actually, there's a massive Japanese influence, I'd say, at the fair. Not necessarily in terms of like the buyers, the people who are coming, but in terms of the aesthetics and the brands that are showing up and that are being picked up. So this year, for example, there's Soshi Otsuki, who's the guest designer, and he's going to be showing tomorrow, which is quite exciting. But yeah.
Just finally then, these have, of course, the last few years for various reasons been quite tricky ones for what we think of as the luxury sector. Are you getting any sense of whether attendees are generally optimistic, pessimistic, that some sort of corner might have been turned?
You know, it's funny because about a year ago, I sensed optimism. 6 months later, as in 6 months ago, I sensed complete pessimism. And now I just feel like there's resolve and a sort of adapting to the new reality, you know, of less pent-up demand after COVID. So I wouldn't even say it's a question of optimism or pessimism. It's just, it is what it is, and people are going to keep doing as much as they can.
Grace Charlton, Monocle's Associate Editor for Design and Fashion. Thank you for joining us. That was Grace speaking to us from Pitti Uomo in Florence. You're listening to the Monocle Daily. Back shortly. I said shortly. This is the Monocle Daily with me, Andrew Muller, and I am joined today for the rest of the show by Giorgia Scaturo, London-based Italian reporter and producer, and by Stephen Diel, Russia analyst and regular Monocle Radio contributor. Hello to you both.
Hello.
You were both away doing exciting stuff, either during or just after Christmas. Stephen, first of all, you went to Georgia, not the US state, the other one.
Yes, Tbilisi. I have a friend who speaks Georgian, and he always insists on, you must say Tbilisi, not Tbilisi.
Okay, good to know.
And I could meet up there with some Russian friends, actually, because it's very easy for Russians to get from Georgia. They don't need a visa, and it was holiday time in Russia. So
easier for them to get to Georgia than you to get to Russia at the moment.
Much easier than that, and even easier for them to get there than come here. So it was a bit of tourism, and also seeing. I hadn't been to Georgia for a few years, and it was. Talk about a place of contrast. Wow. I mean, some of it is beautiful. There's some fabulous buildings, and there are quite a lot of buildings that could be fabulous and probably once were and are now just falling down. It's a strange mix, but conversations we had with locals were generally good. If they were of an older generation, we spoke in Russian. Anyone who was under the age of 30 who wasn't born in the Soviet Union, I would speak to them first in English, and I found only one person who didn't understand what I was saying, one young person. So the younger generation speak English. But it's a fascinating place, and I'd like to go back and spend a bit more time and see a bit more.
Yeah, so would I. I have not been to Georgia for ages, but it is a remarkable, and in the high northwest of the country, up the Svaneti region, possibly the most glorious landscapes to be found anywhere in Europe. To be clear, the Daily is not in any way sponsored by the tourist authorities of Georgia. But you have, Georgia. Sorry, I was getting confused by which Georgia I was addressing there. You've been to a country whose airport I have recently visited briefly twice, which is to say you've been to Oman. I flew via Muscat some of the way to Australia and back recently.
Well, I will encourage you then to get out of the airport and visit.
The airport's very nice.
It is, as is the country. And then in Muscat in particular, I was lucky enough to be one of the first visitors of the Botanic Garden, which has not opened yet and is supposed to be the biggest botanic garden in the world. Okay. Which is quite something. The economy of the country has picked up quite a lot, so they're investing massively on tourism. So from showing me dolphins and green turtles whom I swam with to pushing me down the longest zip line over water in the world, and I'm here to tell the tale. There is a lot to do in Oman.
Okay, we're not sponsored either by the tourist authorities of Oman, I should make clear, but I'm going to go with the veracity of what both our guests have claimed about both those destinations. These are entirely honestly acquired insights. We will start in Ukraine, Russia's 72-hour lightning conquest of which is fast approaching its 4th anniversary. In the apparent lack of any fresh thinking, Russia has continued to batter Ukraine with some of the biggest missile salvos of the war, causing not just further direct death and injury to Ukrainian people, but the second-order hazard of energy outages at the last time of year you would want them. This weekend, Kyiv is expecting overnight temperatures somewhere in the vicinity of -20. While Ukraine is also inviting the citizens of some Russian cities to see how they like it, more than 500,000 people in Belgorod Oblast were without power last week after Ukrainian missile strikes, the European Commission and some individual European leaders are wondering vaguely if engaging directly might, at this point, be useful. Engaging directly with Russia, that is. Stephen, have we arrived at the point at which there is any point trying to have a conversation with Russia?
Not yet, because Vladimir Putin wants the war to carry on, basically. He hasn't achieved anything like the aims that he set out to do nearly 4 years ago. Incidentally, a rather sad fact, I think, is that as of yesterday, this war has been going on for longer than the Soviet Union was engaged in the Second World War, what they call the Great Patriotic War.
During which the Russians covered considerably more ground than they have in this one.
They did indeed, and obviously they had far greater losses, but they were fighting for their own territory. And this is a key factor in this war, that the Russians, basically the Russian army now is full of mercenaries. They're doing it for money. They don't believe that they're defending their motherland, or that most of them don't really think that Ukraine is part of their country. They are simply doing it for money. And in the Great Patriotic War, of course, they were fighting the Germans back from their own territory. So that's a major change. But the war goes on until Putin can claim some sort of victory, at least having those 4 regions, the oblasts in eastern Ukraine plus Crimea, that are now officially part of the Russian constitution, but they're still not fully occupied by Russia. He has to have at least that. Otherwise, he loses face. And this is one thing I was discussing with these Russian friends who are not Putin supporters, I hasten to add, in Georgia, was they said, well, you know, he's a drum I've banged often, which is that the thing that Putin fears most of all is his own people. He fears them far more than the West, or certainly not the United States now, or China or anywhere else. It's this fear. He's in so deep that any sign of weakness, and he would not only lose his presidency, he would probably lose his head. And he knows this. We know, for example, that he watched over and over again pictures of Gaddafi being lynched, and he looks back at Mussolini in Italy in the Second World War, and he sees that terrifies him, something like that happening. So he can't give in. And you mentioned in the lead-in the number of missile attacks. It seems to me the only result of the meeting that took place last year in Alaska between Trump and Putin is that Putin has therefore stepped up the bombardment of Ukraine. And an Oreshnik hypersonic ballistic missile used last week on Lviv, very close to the border with Poland, only about 60 kilometres from the border with Poland. These things are real signs that he's not going to give up. And I think the voices that came out of I think most Europeans are not saying, let's go and talk to Putin. But Macron is kind of hinting that at some point you're going to have to, but I don't think we're anywhere near there yet.
Georgia, President Macron of France is one of the leaders who does seem to suggest that it might be worth engaging with Russia. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has said or suggested much the same thing. Is this them, do you think, acting slightly self-interestedly in trying to keep the EU relevant? Because there's been a lot of concern that some sort of deal is going to get done between Washington and Moscow over Europe's head.
Well, absolutely. But I have to say, a year ago, I was interviewing Stephanie Baker, who's the Bloomberg investigative journalist, on her new book, punishing Putin. And she said, until you really target Russia oil, it is going to be hard to stop Putin financing the war. And now if you think that Europe and Russia have the greater trade on oil and gas, the time has really come for Europe to step up. Last month in December, we had some sort of more sanctions coming through. It's nowhere near what needs to be done at this point. And in fact, we had Giorgia Meloni saying the time has come now to speak with Russia. The problem is, who is going to start this conversation? Because is it going to be Orban or Fico? So Hungary and Slovenia, who are just Slovakia, who's just Putin's best friend, or who else can get into Putin's court? And I think Giorgia Meloni also raised the point, which is if we were to make the mistake to start this conversation and proceed in a disorganized way, we would do Putin a favor. So we would have more weapons against Europe than anything. And so it could be counterproductive. So we need to see how this proceeds. And Davos maybe could be one possibly moment where we go further in figuring out how to establish a dialogue.
Stephen, Davos, of course, might be an opportunity for European leaders to talk to the other key protagonist here. President Trump, as I understand it, is due to attend. He may change his mind about that, as he so very often does. But is there actually, at this point, any more point in trying to engage with him about Ukraine?
I think there's far more point than trying to speak to Putin, because it does seem, and unpredictable though he is, President Trump, it does seem that he will often be swayed by whatever was last whispered into his shell-like ear. And so I think that the Europeans, who at times I find it rather sickening the way they cozy up to him and don't read him the riot act for certain things he's done, but you can't ignore him. You know, we cannot ignore the United States, and he is the man in charge, and he's going to be in charge for the next 3 years at least. And I think that they have to keep telling him that, you know, actually Putin's not a good guy, and that we need to support Ukraine. It may sway him, it may not, but it's better to be telling him that rather than keeping mum and not saying anything at all.
Georgia, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was recently, I think quite remarkably, audibly exasperated about President Trump and his incessant wittering about Greenland. Do you think she's getting to the point where she's starting to think, bearing in mind that she's always seemed to be one of the European leaders he quite likes, that she at least is getting to the point where she would be willing to say, or at least think, that there is simply no point in Europe waiting around for the United States anymore?
Yes. I think if you think of European leaders, Giorgia Meloni is the closest to Trump, let alone because she is sort of like the queen of Europe. And so, but that relationship, she's been forced to say that some measures are better taken by, think of Venezuela, it was the legitimate action, but yet, is up to the country to establish the government. So Giorgia Meloni is somehow taking some distances from the tyrant who goes veni vidi vicit, in a way. We have to say that everybody at this point is counting on Trump to make some personal commitment to what he said. We've seen, the security guarantees that he's basically offered, but now we want to see the personal backing to what he says. And how easy is that to expect him to be committed when, Stephen, you mentioned Alaska, but the first thing that came to my mind was the red carpet and this arm stretched towards Putin. Who's going to tell us that when Putin calls Trump and says, hey, Trump doesn't say, no, I'm in for the security guarantee, it's not going to happen. So the credibility of Trump now needs to to be seen in action, actually. And Giorgia Meloni, in a way, is tilting both ways, but she knows that energy is needed in Europe. She's actually committed billions to reduce the energy bills of Italians at the moment. So she will need forcibly to make a stand.
Well, to the world of trade and a reminder of the superhuman patience it requires of those professionally involved therein. There are now certainly people who have been involved in the years of negotiations over the free trade agreement between the EU and South American countries of Mercosur who were outlasted by the talks. However, a quarter century of wrangling over wood pulp quotas is over. The EU-Mercosur free trade deal is done, pending the agreement of the European Parliament. A breakthrough which has prompted the traditional mutual and/or self-congratulation from all parties to such deals, and the no less traditional spectacle of aggrieved French farmers on tractors pulling angry donuts around the Arc de Triomphe. Stephen, their difficulties and issues notwithstanding, is it fair to say, without sounding like crazed neocon headbangers, that free trade agreements are usually basically a good thing?
I think that's fair, yeah. But as you say, maybe nowadays we're not supposed to be liberal, but many of us are. And yeah, it is. But I think the thing that overshadows all this really is what's going on in that part of the world with Trump. Is he seizing Venezuela? He seized the president.
He seems to have lost interest in that one pretty quickly, to be honest.
Yeah, but except the court case will be going on, and he doesn't seem to have got the oil companies as excited about extracting Venezuelan oil as he thought would happen. But nevertheless, I think that whole action and the reaction of Colombia and Cuba, which I know are not part of Mercosur, but it just puts that whole part of the world in a state of anxiety, in a state of uncertainty. And I think it's quite possible that action has actually hastened this deal. And Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, the Mercosur members are probably very glad to at least have an agreement, have something, some sort of, even if it's just a bit of paper for now, to say, look, we're cooperating with Europe. We're not just being left alone, because of course the overriding factor is that Trump sees that as his part of the world and it wants everyone to keep out. So I think that in that sense, it's good news.
Georgia, might this go both ways, though? Might the Europeans be kind of happy that they feel like they actually have some reliable allies on the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, I think, first of all, it'd be interesting to see now if this new trade that, let's remember, it's impacting 800 million people that might have lower prices of food, whether this trade now, after 25 years, as you were saying, is concluded, whether it will sparkle an appetite for global norms again, for rules, as an alternative to Trump. And that, we'll have to see the same norms that have alienated Italy, for instance. And our approach was one of skepticism and caution, because, when farmers' rights or farmers' standards are in issue, it's very difficult. But now we will have to see how, the business is big, the opportunities are big, how each of the countries will implement this new trade. We have now 17th of January, this trade, we have the ceremony and the official signature signing, but then in mid-2026, the European Parliament will vote on the agreement, and then we'll start seeing how the single countries involved will implement it. We are continuing to see demonstrations, quite spectacular ones, the tractors, the milk being, put out on the street. And that, again, is because we want to somehow safeguard fair prices, standards. But when we talk about standards, we also have to think of Trump, no standards, completely freedom. So in a way, maybe this whole trade will push people to rethink that standards are in fact important somehow, especially when it comes to food. And especially it's important to have alternatives to tariffs, threats, political repercussions. We can do without this.
Well, to Iran and to grudging acknowledgement that the generally witless trolling engaged in by X and its proprietor Elon Musk does have its moments, if only due to the law of averages. In response to a request by a mischievous user, X has changed its Iran flag emoji. So instead of the flag flown by the Iranian regime, as of this broadcast, etc., it shows the flag as it was before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, with a lion and sun crest between the green and red stripes instead of the current logo depicting 4 crescents and a sword. As a consequence, several official accounts attached to the Iranian regime, which of course blocks X for ordinary Iranians, suddenly appeared to be flying the flag of the Shah they overthrew. Stephen, it's probably an even worse period than usual to admit that you found anything that Elon Musk may have said, done or authorised amusing. But is this at least kind of funny?
Kind of funny. I think it's a very good way of putting it, Andrew. I almost thought this should be the last item on the show tonight, given that we tend to end with something that raises a smile. Listeners, we've gone bleak for our final item tonight. I'm just putting that out there. Right, so that's why it's coming in number 3. But it does seem an extraordinary thing to do, in response to a request. Apparently, if you look on anywhere else, then you won't find the old flag. The thing that made me think most, what's he doing now? Trump or his acolytes. It's a very strange thing to do. Suddenly bring the flag. It has been seen. In fact, there's one or two pictures that are around of demonstrations certainly one in London I've seen where it's got the old flag. But it's not the whole point of the demonstrations. I mean, they weren't sparked by people saying bring back the Shah tomorrow. They were sparked because of food shortages and energy shortages and water shortages and all sorts of other problems. And of course, we shouldn't really be laughing because it's what's going on now. I mean, there is open murder on the streets. I heard one interview earlier today with someone who was using the words that they'd spoken to someone in Iran who didn't want their voice to be used, and saying you're almost sentencing yourself to death if you just go on the streets. So the funny side of this emoji apart, it's actually a very, very serious situation. Some of us are old enough to remember 1979 and the overthrow of the Shah, and at that time there was great hope, and people didn't realise what the Ayatollah Khomeini, as it was coming in then, was going to turn the country into. But I think that this is it rather distracts from the seriousness of the situation. But it's still an extraordinary thing for Musk or whoever it was to do, because no one else has done it. If you got an iPhone and you look on your emojis, you'll still see the old flag.
He's the expert, right, in driving engagement, and he's an advocate of free speech, so anything can happen on X, which, as you point out,
he's an advocate of some free speech, i.e. the free speech he agrees with.
Yeah, let's hear what happens with grok and nudity. But more dangerous than nudity at the moment is what Stevens was pointing out, what happens on the street, and the fact that Trump itself has chosen social media platform to say, keep demonstrating, help is coming, without saying when and how help is coming. I think we should really take things seriously. It shows a complete lack of responsibility on human lives that are lost at any minute.
Which does prompt a serious question just finally on this, Stephen. As Georgia correctly points out, President Trump has been posting to the effect that help is on the way to the Iranian demonstrators. Is it possible that this might actually fit in with his appetite for foreign interventions as we understand it, i.e. a short, sharp shock that stirs things up a bit? Because if there is a pattern to his foreign policy, this is what it's been. He's always objected to the long-term nation-building projects. His objections to things like the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq do not seem to be so much that the US helped tip out an unpleasant regime, as the US assuredly did on both occasions, but the US then spent decades, money and lives trying to turn these places into analogues of the United States. If somebody comes to him with the suggestion that, look, if we just whack several regime targets, this might tip it over the edge, you can see that appealing to him.
I'm sure it would appeal. What worries me, this, as you say, he's saying, help is on its way. This has echoes of 1956, the Hungarian uprising, when Voice of America led Hungarians to believe that the Americans were on their way. They were going to help them. They were going to push the Russians out of the country, the Soviet troops. And of course, it encouraged more Hungarians to go on the streets. And as a result, more Hungarians died in the Hungarian uprising. And of course, the Soviet Union did clamp down on it very heavily. And, Hungary was very much put back in its pro-Soviet box, as it were. So, there is history of the Americans doing this and it not turning out well. I think that language that Trump has used is very irresponsible, but I just wonder, with the actions of the Revolutionary Guard and the Iranian authorities, whether actually people would be listening too much. The internet's been cut off anyway, so they're not going to hear much from him, which is probably a good thing because, as Georgia said, we're talking human lives here, and the Iranian authorities have shown that they are not prepared to compromise.
Well, to China, finally, and to encouraging tidings for those of our Chinese listeners who may be preoccupied by concerns about being eaten rather by domestic pets once their time in this corporeal realm is up. There is a new app called Silema, which apparently translates as "Are you dead yet?" Though such are the minute vicissitudes of Chinese pronunciation that I feel obliged to apologise for any calumny I may just inadvertently have issued vis-à-vis the sobriety of anyone's father or the modesty of their mother. Anyway, users of Silema are asked to affirm once a day that they are in fact still with us. If they repeatedly fail to heed the prompts, their contacts are alerted, which could prompt no end of amusing hijinks in the circles of the disorganised or unreliable. Georgia, are you downloading this or waiting for the British and or Italian equivalent thereof? What is the Italian for "Are you dead yet"?
Sei morto? I am absolutely furious. I'm fuming. The listeners can't see me. But first of all, the question, since when elderly and frail people have been hooked in technology and apps? My mum, 86 years old, can't even answer the phone because she inadvertently pressed the airplane mode. So that is not going to work, is it? But Andrew, I would like to take the chance to make an appeal from your show. Apologies.
Go on.
Any coder, engineer, startup to make a different kind of app, which I would call it, "Are you alive and loved yet?" And this would resound on any daughter, son, nephew, to remember them, to call their parents, their grandparents, their auntie or any loved one who is not coping particularly well at least once a day, and give them company. Physical company, I would say.
What if their elderly relatives would rather just be left in peace?
Oh, that's another matter. They will be able to say so.
Okay, that is actually that's the more optimistic, I guess, antidote to this. Stephen, do you think that this is a sort of dispatch from a looming dystopia, or is this just merely a practical acknowledgement of the way more and more people live? There are, according to most estimates, around 200 million people in China who live alone.
But even so, as George has said, those to whom this question might be most appropriately addressed probably aren't that tech savvy, even in China. And it just seems Very bad taste. I love George's idea, actually. Yes, are you alive and loved? That's brilliant. Yes, just a little nudge to the next generation, the younger generation, to say, give them a call, just to see if they're okay, which is far more sensible. I mean, but this idea of, you mentioned the word dystopian, I think that's very good, because the idea of having an app, it brings in shades of 1984 and the screen on the wall that's actually watching you, and so no, I think it's a bonkers idea, to be perfectly honest.
Are you reassured, I should ask, Georgia, that the developers of this app have factored in everything that could possibly go wrong? Because there are a lot of people out there who are somewhat disorganized or lackadaisical, just not very good with technology, might forget that, oh yeah, I was supposed to press that button that stops all my friends and family from flying into a complete panic.
Well, Andrew, to put this simply, I can't see anything that could possibly go right with this app. Enough said.
Stephen, there is a debate apparently just finally on the name of this app. There are those people who would prefer it was called something a bit more upbeat. Not quite what Georgia suggested, but instead are suggesting, are you still alive? Not, are you dead yet? Would that make you feel any better about using it?
Not really, but I mean, are you dead yet? It suggests that you are, So are you still alive?
It suggests at best an amount of impatience.
How do you answer yes? Are you dead?
Well, indeed, that's the point. Yes.
No, it sounds like the kind of question your grandchildren ask while they're sort of writing their initials on the bottom of things in your house.
I remember actually my mother saying to me many years ago that I think she'd just turned 60, and a small boy, the son of a neighbour, sort of said, it was a birthday, and he said, how old? And she said, well, I've just turned 60. And this small child, aged about 6, sort of had eyes wide, and looked at my mother and said, "And you're still alive."
Well, on that heartening note, Stephen Deal and Georgia Scaturo, thank you both for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Georgia Scaturo and Stephen Deal, also to Grace Charlton. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Annalise Maynard. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.